Well, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and about the work I do with cult survivors. I left Siddha Yoga, the religious community I'd lived and worked in for more than a decade, in 1994. And that was simultaneous practically to when I began my training for my master's degree in social work with the aim of becoming a psychotherapist. So I asked my supervisor at my clinical internship, who was a psychoanalyst, for some reading, and she recommended two books: Alice Miller's Drama of the Gifted Child and Kohut's How Does Analysis Cure? In that first book, I began learning about narcissism. And in the second one, I began learning about empathy. I realized that the guru I had just left was a narcissist, a traumatizing narcissist. And I realized that Guru Maya, as she's known, who was my guru for 13 years, from 83 to 94, didn't have a compassionate, empathetic way of relating to people. I believe compassionate empathy had been killed in her by her guru, the late Swami Muktananda. He was a successful guru who had been credibly accused of many abuses of power, including predatory pedophilia and multiple sexual assaults. And what grew in the place where empathy could have been in Guru Maya, as I knew her, was contempt. Contempt for whoever she couldn't control, and contempt disguised as marketed as the grace of the guru for the people she did control. I read dozens and dozens of other psychoanalytic books, especially the works of Erich Fromm, as I got my master's degree. And my first effort to theorize about the malignant narcissism of cult leaders became my final paper for grad school, which is called Traumatic Abuse in Cults, a Psychoanalytic Perspective, which is a paper that's in the ICSA archives. So fast forward to around 2015, my psychotherapy practice is going well, but I realized that my training hadn't taken me as far as I wanted to go when it came to helping my most severely traumatized clients, some of whom had extreme dissociative symptoms. So I began to study the work of contemporary traumatologists, clinicians who had been developing trauma treatments informed by research in neuroscience. This research changed everything for those who had been focused on treating PTSD. It informed the work of Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk, Alan Shor's research linked to psychotherapy, Onno van der Hart's theory of structural dissociation, Dan Siegel's work on the brain, the mind, Patricia Ogden, Janina Fisher's work in sensory motor psychotherapy, and Richard Schwartz's theory of internal family systems. And I've been studying all of these folks now for the past 5 or 6, 7 years. I also looked at EMDR and DBT, and all of this exposure to trauma theory, which, by the way, was inspired by my psychoanalytic supervisor, Philip Bromberg. All of that exposure enabled me to come closer to solving the puzzle that I've encountered with every significantly traumatized client that I've ever worked with, whether abused in a cult or not. And I'm referring to the puzzle of self-alienation. How is it that people who have suffered serious abuse turn against themselves with self-denigration and contempt? Some form of self-alienation is always the legacy of any kind of trauma experience with which one has been left alone without help to process. To become self-alienated is to lose compassion for one's wounded, victimized self. And without help, traumatized people tend to feel ashamed of their victimization, ashamed of their ongoing emotional dysregulation. They're trying to get over their trauma. They want to be the person who looks and feels strong, not the one who was shattered and humiliated. Ashamed of the wounded part of themselves, they become self-blaming and self-loathing. Recognizing and understanding this self-alienation, finding and experiencing compassion for one's most vulnerable self is what I think is at the heart of recovery from traumatic abuse in cults. Now, today I'm focusing on the relational dynamics between cult leaders and followers and how that impacts the follower's relationship to the self. So I'm not discussing all the other issues that we deal with in cult recovery. Cultists have survived slave labor conditions, sleep, nutrition deprivation, repetitive trance-inducing states. These conditions and all the situations that have led to moral injury and betrayal trauma, all of that needs to be accounted for when we're helping ex-members. But my focus today is where I think actually the most traumatic harm is done, and that's to the sense of self. So to understand how the traumatic relationship with the cult turns one against the self, I think it's important to understand the psychology of the cult leader. And I've discussed that elsewhere. And there's a video of a talk I gave on the ICSA YouTube channel, but I'll review that a little bit here. So what's the traumatic harm done by cult leaders? The traumatizing narcissist cult leader demands that followers bestow him or her with endless respect, admiration, love, compassion. You have to give all of yourself, your heart, your mind, your soul, your body. And what followers are indoctrinated not to see is that this is the only real purpose of the cult, to create a one-way channel on which followers send up all their time and energy, money, love. And as with all multi-level marketing schemes, nothing real, nothing truly transformative comes back down from the leader. Instead, the cultist is drained, exhausted, and made to lose trust and faith in her internal resources, her intellect, judgment, her intuition. Cultists are persuaded that their only strength and power comes from the cult and their subjugation to the leader, not from within themselves. So followers are expected to back up the cult leader's claim that he or she freely bestows love and compassion on them, that the leader unselfishly bestows meaning and value on people who previously were wasting their lives. In fact, the leader's so-called love is entirely conditional on how willing and able you are to gratify him, to give whatever you have that is of value to him. And yet followers under the influence believe against all evidence to the contrary that they're the ones who are receiving. And how does that happen? Cult leaders manipulate followers by alternating between love bombing and magnifying and exploiting the followers' insecurities. In behavioral psychology, it's called intermittent reinforcement. While being intermittently attentive and seductive, the leader destabilizes the follower through three relational behaviors that are the hallmark of the traumatizing narcissist's MO. Those three: intimidation, belittling, and humiliation. I'll say it again. You can repeat along with me: intimidation, belittling, and humiliation. If somebody is repeatedly exhibiting these three behaviors in relationships, it's pretty likely that that person is a traumatizing narcissist who will not be willing to be accountable for their destructive, exploitative actions. In cults, and this applies to one-on-one cults too, these sadistic, controlling behaviors are recast in Orwellian fashion as the means the cult leader must use in order for the follower to reach the end. The cult's end is stated in various ways, but it always involves a requirement of purification. The follower is by definition impure, and whatever the end of the cult's transformation process is said to be, the follower has no hope of attaining it until he's deemed purified by the leader. So that's the basis on which the leader claims the right to subjugate, control, and exploit the follower indefinitely. The end justifies the means is one of Machiavelli's most famous dictums. And that MO is diagnostic for cults and for traumatizing narcissists. His belief in his perfection and omnipotence is delusional. So for the leader to sustain that delusion requires followers to join the delusion. Joining the leader's delusion, initially experienced as exhilarating, as giving meaning to one's own life, turns out to be totally life draining. What begins in ecstatic, expansive surrender soon becomes negating, humiliating submission. This idea about expansive surrender as opposed to negating submission was developed by Emmanuel Gent in a paper that he wrote that I think we have bibliography information we can share with everybody. And it's also elaborated in the work of Jessica Benjamin, especially in her novel, her book, The Bonds of Love. Both were psychoanalysts, Jessica Benjamin, a feminist psychoanalyst. Followers, often without knowing it, live with the constant underlying fear that the person they idolize will do to them what they've been witnessing done to others, that the leader will unexpectedly turn on them and tear them apart for their flaws, usually in front of their peers. In her book, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, Alexandra Stein, a psychologist specializing in the area of cults and attachment trauma, has made the extremely useful connection to the state of disorganized attachment in recognizing the state of fear with no solution that cult followers find themselves in. The more they fear the leader, the more followers have to try to cling closer to the leader, who's also their tormentor, and they have to furnish the leader with more and more gratification in hopes of being tormented less. It's a situation that demands dissociation, which Frank Putnam called the escape when there is no escape. Leaving the cult and rejecting the leader takes a great deal of strength, but leaving's no guarantee that you can just let go of the self-doubt and the fear that the leaders cultivated in you. If this deeply instilled self-alienation goes unrecognized and untreated, the ex-member may be unable to cease being hyper-giving. You know, if I'm such a terrible, bad person, if I'm super giving and selfless, maybe that'll redeem me, right? And so when you're hyper-giving, you believe your only value is being unselfish. And unfortunately, that makes you vulnerable to fall into relationships with selfish, unaccountable takers in one-on-one relationships or in other cults. And so for this and many other reasons, psychoeducation geared to understanding the psychology and the behavior of the traumatizing narcissist cult leader, and to the recognition of how self-alienation is instilled and perpetuated by the cult, is essential to how I work when I'm helping cult survivors. Cults indoctrinate followers to believe that to improve the self, one must hold one's pre-cult self in contempt. In this way, cults magnify and exploit self-alienation, regardless to what degree it existed prior to one's involvement in the cult. To help clients grasp the meaning of self-alienation, I explain that most people naturally have an inner critic, a kind of internal regulating voice. Freud termed that part of the mind the superego, and he related it to the moral conscience. Trauma theorists view that kind of mental activity as stemming from a protector part of the self, an instinctually protective aspect of the human mind, focused on safety and survival. The protective part of the self is instinctually trying to steer us in the right direction and steer us away from trouble. So far, so good. But under conditions of extreme stress, like growing up in a traumatizing, neglectful family or being part of a cult. The lack of safety, whether psychological, bodily, or both, can lead the inner protective voice to become a chronic inner persecutor. It happens in this way. The voice that wants to protect you by alerting you to actual danger is now, as a result of too much trauma, suggesting that you should be continually hypervigilant, that you should always be expecting the worst. That's basically what PTSD is. The bodily, emotional, psychological experience that the terrible thing that happened then is about to happen or is already happening all over again. The experience of chronically feeling helpless and terrified, unable to feel in control, produces intense shame, as though that weakness that you feel is your own fault. And this frightened part of the self becomes flooded with shame, the sense of being weak, defective, bad. To be unduly ashamed of oneself is to be alienated from oneself. The idea of the protector part becoming a persecutor is a concept developed by the Jungian analyst Donald Kalshed, and it's understood in other trauma therapies as well. And it helps us to understand the trauma survivors' internal world. Survivors attach a narrative to their PTSD symptoms, their hypervigilance, their fear, and their mistrust. And that narrative ultimately puts the blame for their fear on themselves. The protector turned persecutor internally is self-shaming. This is how the abusive messages instilled by the cult leader who controlled you when you were in the cult now control you when you're out of the cult. It's how they become self-perpetuating. I find that clients are greatly helped when they're taught these ideas and they're able to use them as part of learning to self-regulate, to be able to stay consciously present more consistently and to better tolerate triggers and emotional ups and downs. When you leave a cult, it's easy to think of yourself as stupid for having been so gullible, for letting yourself be abused and humiliated. It's easy to feel shamefully bad about yourself for a million different reasons, but it's not always obvious that in doing so, the ex-member has internalized exactly what they were indoctrinated to believe, that they're deserving of feeling intimidated and of being belittled, of being humiliated. In a sense, the survivors carrying on the work of breaking down the self that the cult leader didn't get to finish. Often cult survivors believe, sometimes semi-consciously, that they didn't follow the leader's teachings well enough, or that they didn't have the strength to stay in the group. And that explains why they suffer now after having left. As with children of abusive parents, followers who entered a childlike state of guru worship are sometimes drawn to blaming themselves for their abuse without realizing that doing so is protecting the abuser. This was the understanding of the psychoanalyst Ronald Fairbairn, who called this the moral defense. He described how children of abusive parents instinctively know that to survive, they've got to stay attached to the parent. And so to stay attached to an abusive and neglectful parent, the child takes on the burden of the badness. The child makes himself guilty and bad, and he justifies the parents' behavior and by making them good. Fairbairn put it this way: it's better to be a sinner in a world ruled by God than to live in a world ruled by the devil. Cults encourage regression to childlike idealization of leaders like parent gods. And even when followers repudiate the cult, this instinctive tendency to bear the burden of the badness often lingers. Here's an example. A 30-year-old graphic designer who had left his Christian fundamentalist family and community in Texas came to New York to find freedom, but he was plagued with obsessional fears about himself. He described repeated episodes in childhood of being basically verbally assaulted by his parents and other adults in the name of religion. As a child, he was made to be so terrified at home, in church, and in school of every worldly thing that he developed obsessive compulsive disorder. As an adult in New York and Brooklyn, being a young, hipster graphic designer, he developed, he knew how distorted the worldview of his parents and their church was. But when I expressed compassion for what he'd suffered as a child, he'd visibly stiffen. His affect would become hard and cold. You could see his body get rigid. One part of him could tell me how terrifying and fanatic his parents and others in the church were. Yet another part of him refused to feel compassion for the child self who had been terrified, and it refused to have any feelings other than positive ones about the adults who had frightened him. So it was only after a weekend during which he used psychedelic mushrooms, which I wasn't aware he was doing, that he came back to our session bursting with self-love and self-compassion. And although that compassion didn't become stable quickly or easily, the experience was really powerful. And he could now engage more consciously in struggling with his conflicted self-regard. Another client spent many years in a very high position in a cult, and later in life, she started paying attention to the cult literature and to many accounts about her now deceased guru that ex-followers were putting online. And while with her guru, she had perfected the techniques of dissociation. She stilled her mind to the point of being able to witness and endure abuse without naming or experiencing it as such. And she was thereby able to firmly maintain her complete and total passivity and submission. As her recovery began, as she looked back on all those years of complete, unquestioning submission, it was as if all her dissociation broke loose. She was flooded with a lifetime of suppressed terror and rage. Outbursts of panic rage were followed by deep feelings of shame and fears that she was irretrievably damaged. After painful emotional dysregulation for months, her sense of self shifted when she read the accounts of others who were describing their abuse in the group. She decided to join them online, and she began to tell her story, and that marked a line for her. Instead of being flooded again and again with shame and fear, she began to develop a sense of herself as part of a healing community in which she could play a meaningful role, in which she could join with others in compassion for what they'd all been through. For both these clients, it was easier at first to define themselves by the vulnerabilities they experienced and the shame they felt about themselves than to define themselves in a way that acknowledged and honored their very considerable strengths. While much of the psychoeducational work I do with cult survivors is about providing information specific to cult recovery, I also want to educate them on how to self-reflect and how to self-regulate, because these are the essential tools that can help create an internal compassionate relationship between their present-day adult self and the traumatized shame and fear parts of the self to which they more readily relate. The present-day adult self is the one who survived the cult, who left the cult. But often this strong, healthy part of the self is minimized because the trauma parts are in the foreground and they're much more intense and loud and vivid. So I repeatedly point out to these clients that when they're triggered and their traumatized parts take over, they lose sight of this strong, healthy part of themselves. And I explain that triggering experiences bring up physical and emotional responses automatically, pre-reflectively. Self-reflection allows for understanding of these triggered responses, which makes self-regulation possible. The capacity for self-reflection is often cited as a psychotherapy goal, and the client's ability to be self-reflective as a sign that the work has been successful. But I prefer to reach that goal not just by modeling what self-reflection looks like and hoping it catches on, but actively to encourage clients to be self-reflective by teaching them what that means, how it's done, and why it matters. This is done in sensory motor psychotherapy, in mindfulness work, in Fonagy's work on mentalization psychotherapy. Rather than use their minds for genuine self-reflection, cult survivors have been led to focus all their attention on the mind of the leader, and in many cases have been literally practicing emptying their minds and filling them with images of the leader and the leader's words and thoughts. They've been anxiously preoccupied with trying to read the leader's mind, trying to gauge the leader's current level of approval or disapproval. So self-reflection is meant to help bring them back to their own minds, to help clients learn to know their own minds better. And in order to help them with that, I note with them, as we're talking, moments of affective intensity or abrupt switches in self-states or subtle or obvious body movements or gaps in the narrative. And I suggest, let's slow down. Let's notice what's going on. I'll say things like, can we stay with that for a moment? Let's slow down there. Something happened. I noticed a shift. Can you say what happened? Did something shift in your body? What did it feel like? Let's stay with that. Do feelings come up? Are you reminded of something? Let's be curious. As clients tell me a story of something that recently happened outside of the session, I'll run through that same process. And I explain, we're going to self-reflect. And I encourage them to use self-reflection as often as they can between sessions. So when an anxious, frustrated client asks for homework, what do I do? How do I fix that? You know, my answer is to provide detailed information, probably not for the first time, about how they can self-reflect. If they're willing to try and try again, to be curiously self-reflective, in and out of the consulting room, they can begin to understand what triggers their dysregulation. They develop curiosity about and respect for their own thoughts and feelings. They become able to find meaning in what they're experiencing. The words I say over and over are, that's interesting. Let's be curious about that. I'm trying to help these clients re-subjectify themselves. They have made themselves the best object they could for the sake of the cult and the leader. Now it's time to stop making yourself an object and become a subject, a me. But what most often occurs when self-reflection is newly taken up is that the client recognizes triggers and knows what they're feeling, but they react with self-contempt. I got triggered, they'll say. I can't believe what a stupid, whiny baby I am when I'm triggered. And I'll have to say, no, that's not how to relate to your triggered trauma states. What if you were understanding and compassionate to those parts of yourself? Then what would you say? And it's amazing how hard this can be for people, how deep that self-negating tendency can be. Many repetitions of this kind of exchange are usually required before compassionate understanding replaces knee-jerk self-contempt and self-condemnation. All right, I know I'm running a little over, but I think it's just another 5 minutes, so I'll just finish up quick here. It's important, in my view, for these clients to understand how emotionally dysregulated they were while attempting to live according to the norms of their cult. In almost all cults, members are expected to work ceaselessly with a sense of urgency to fulfill the leader's mission, which in the end is about the leader's self-aggrandizement and nothing more. Cult recovery involves learning to pay attention to your internal states and recognize when you're anxiously driving yourself the way you were driven in the cult, or recognize when you're numbing and disconnecting and dissociating, and understand those are PTSD symptoms of dysregulation that need your attention. Affect regulation, Alan Shor's work, the work of Dan Hill. This is the other essential skill I talk about endlessly. And this involves understanding and addressing chronic internal states of distress that are triggered. Neuroscience research and psychology over the last decades has opened up many new strategies that are helpful for these chronically dysregulated clients. And one way that I choose to help them is to introduce them to the concept of the window of tolerance. That's a term coined by psychiatrist Dan Siegel. Lorna, are you able to bring up that image? Thank you, Lorna. So let's leave that up for a little bit. In the window of tolerance model, Siegel proposes that between the extremes of hyperarousal, that's above those lines, overwhelmed, anxious, and angry, and feeling out of control, and hypoarousal, that's below the lines, numb, frozen, shut down. There's a window in which a broad range of emotions can be felt, reflected on, and made meaningful, rather than feeling involuntary, meaningless, and out of control. This window is shown in that chart, and I almost always end up sharing the graphic with all my clients. The window of tolerance model gives the self-reflective clients some insight into their chronic dysregulation. Often they realize that they spend little or no time in the window of tolerance. Instead, they realize they're ricocheting from hyper to hypo, panicky, angry, frustrated, to numb, shut down, without getting into that window. So excitement leaves the upper end and becomes overwhelming. Disappointment, anger, and hurt leave the bottom edge and become numbness and shame. Clients can involve us for a long period of time in listening to grievances and solving their problems. But while their chronic systemic dysregulation is going on, which represents the memory, the unconscious memory of the perpetrator's abuse, and it's the source of their feelings of helplessness and self-deprecation, their problems won't be solved unless they can learn to self-regulate, self-reflection and self-regulation. So this, Lauren, if you'll take that image back down now. Just there, thank you so much. So to summarize, I approach post-cult recovery as a particular form of PTSD. I incorporate information about how trauma affects the brain and the nervous system in my approach. And I especially try to promote self-reflection as the means of recognizing self-alienation and achieving self-regulation. The process of cult recovery is a process of emancipation from the subjugating control of the cult. The ability to self-reflect and self-regulate is to reclaim one's innate self-healing resources. Finding access to these internal resources, along with access to external supports and resources, is how it becomes possible to heal self-alienation and regain the sense of wholeness, strength, and dignity that was battered and weakened in the cult. All right, so I'll leave it there.